I remember as a kid watching in black and white at home Magnus Magnuson and Richard Atkinson at Silbury Hill. And that was a very interesting, pioneering piece of television that ultimately was a complete disaster, both for archaeology and for television, as it happened. But it's interesting how much things have changed since then. And I think now a commissioning editor is not going to believe in archaeologists. An archaeologist goes to the BBC and says, "I think if we dig this, we'll find that," and the broadcaster will say, "Why do you think that?"
Because if you look at a lot of the evidence that comes out of archaeology, it's not spectacular. If you look at what came out of Silbury Hill, environmental evidence, seeds, insects, that sort of thing, but there wasn't any treasure. There wasn't the golden horse with the golden rider that legend says was in the centre of Silbury Hill. And I think that television was disappointed. There's obviously been a huge increase in the number of programmes about archaeology in recent years. And I must admit, as an archaeologist, I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that more is necessarily better.
And I think one reason why we see a lot of archaeology is simply the success of Time Team. It's worked very, very well for Channel 4. The BBC has been struggling for years to produce something like Time Team. That's generated a lot of television about archaeology on BBC Two.
Because before that, you got quite a lot of very straightforward documentaries about new discoveries of significance. But obviously what was done with Time Team was to say, right, how can we jazz up archaeology? How can we make it more exciting, more popular? I think the fundamental reason why the media has got this love affair with archaeology is that it's about the past, which is fascinating, but it's a lively way into the past, and it's about discovery. And it's about the sort of discovery that you don't necessarily get with straightforward history.
And in a way, archaeology appeals to people because I don't think that archaeology pretends that there is a correct and an incorrect view of the past, which I think history sometimes does do. You either take the David Starkey view of the Tudors or you're wrong.
Because somebody trawling through documents in a library and finding something new isn't, quite frankly, as exciting as somebody digging something up, showing you an object that's been in the ground for several thousand years and saying, this will change our understanding of this site or this culture.
I think it makes far more sense to get to, let's say, the 11th century by way of some smashed up bits of pottery and some old sheep bones than via the Doomsday Book. People can identify with the sheep bones in a way that they can't identify with Doomsday.
Because this is as much about the medium as it is about archaeology. And if you're to understand how archaeology works on television, then you need to understand television. And television is a craft and an industry, and there are a lot of skills involved, and there are people who are good at it, and there are people who are bad at it. And I think that is, to me, as interesting and it's an important a subject as the quality or otherwise of the archaeology that's being presented.
The first programme that I ever was involved in was an experiment in how Stonehenge was built. And the BBC for that made a full-size concrete replica trilithon, 40-ton uprights and a 10-ton lintel. Now, nobody had experimented with full-size replicas before because of the cost. That particular experiment that was subsequently written up as a proper academic paper really did give us new insight into how those stones could have been moved, how Stonehenge could have been built.
Yes, I think sometimes you can make contributions. I think the reconstruction of the circular timber structure at Seahenge was innovative. We got a lot out of it. In particular, I mean, I had no idea that anything like that had such a strong sort of smell. And its acoustics were extraordinary. But the main thing that hit you, you went in there and you were almost hit in the face by a wall of tannic acid.
And with Blood of the Vikings, the genetics project that was commissioned from University College London, I mean, that wouldn't have been carried out if it hadn't been for that programme. And it was quite bold because we did not know what the results were going to be, and quite frankly the results were not as exciting as we hoped they were going to be, but it had been done.
So you get quite a nice feel for what would have been going on there. But the fact that this was revealed on television, I mean, you could have done the reconstruction without doing it on television. It's just that television provided the money and the expertise and all the rest of it to do that.
At the moment, it's quite a time of change, I think, for archaeology on television, because some of the older strands have now disappeared and new strands are taking their place. I'm slightly worried that what's happening is that the format is taking over.
Once you've thought up a clever format, you then don't have to think about editorial content. And to me, that's anathema. When I write a book, I like to write a book with stories in it. And when I make a television program, I like that program to have a strong storyline. And if the story doesn't fit with a format, too bad.
And that although what archaeology can deliver are new discoveries, new insight into the past, that really this isn't seen as being enough now. So I'm slightly worried as an archaeologist, who isn't po-faced and serious about it and acknowledges that we have to popularise and maybe show archaeology in a slightly different way than we normally do it, that it's actually going a little bit too far.
I think that television archaeology has a right to exist on its own, and the fact that it pulls in millions of viewers and brings them into our subject, I think, is justification in itself.
But most people spend a large part of their lives watching it, and perhaps even more thinking about what they've seen. So for me, archaeology on television is a very, very big part of what we as archaeologists should be thinking about and engaging with.